Well, this is the first in a new series of videos that I'm going to be putting out for you called 5 Minutes in Church History. And they're called that because each video will be about 5 minutes long, and the subject of the videos will be that of the history of the church. I believe that it is important for us to study church history, and especially in these days. And so I want to just begin in this first video by establishing for you why I believe it is important for us to study church history. And there are lots of reasons I could give, but let me just offer you 5 in this first video. First, it's important to study the history of the church for understanding. We cannot understand where we are right now without knowing something of where we came from in the past. The fact is that we stand on the shoulders of previous generations of Christians. And so even when you think about things like, well, where did we get this term, the Trinity, from? Or how did the church come about to be in America? Or if you ask something more recent, like, how is it that this church came into existence that I'm a part of? Each of those questions can only be answered by looking at church history. And the answer to those questions about where we came from will help you to understand where you are right now in the present and how to navigate that situation that you live in. Secondly, it's important to understand or to study church history for remembering. So if you think about even the Bible itself, the Bible is in some ways a story which tells you about the history of God's dealing with his people in times past and the record of their acts in history. And when you study church history, you're seeing the history of what has happened in the history of the church from Acts chapter 28 at the very end until the present. It's in some ways a continuation of the story that we have in the Bible. Of course, it's not inspired like the biblical record, but it still tells you of God's dealings in times past and of what God's people have been doing in times past. And by looking at these things, by remembering these things from times past, we will learn lessons that the church has learned in times past so that we don't repeat their mistakes. And we learn how God has dealt with his people in times past so that we can understand how he will deal with us today. So studying church history is important, second of all, for remembering. And then third, studying church history is also important for instruction. So just like you and I, we learn from the example of and the teaching of Christians today, well, so we can do so from Christians in times past. We will learn more about, for instance, what the Bible teaches by studying the church in generations past and the insights they had into the Bible. We will learn how to live the Christian life by viewing and studying the example of faithful Christians who went before us and unfaithful Christians so that we could see negative examples as well. And then fourth, it's important to study church history for perspective. We often make mistakes in our thinking and in our acting because we lack perspective. We think, for instance, that we're the first generation of Christians to experience certain things, or that we're the first people in the history of the church to have certain insights or to accomplish certain things for Christ. But church history teaches us otherwise. It gives us perspective. It plugs us into a larger story which keeps us balanced, which keeps us from, for instance, becoming too proud or too discouraged as we see what the church has gone through in times past. And then finally, church history is important for praise of God. Because church history, like biblical history, tells the story of God's acts in history to accomplish his purposes of redemption and of judgment upon the earth. And so as you study the history of the church, it will fill you with awe of God to see how he has worked in the lives of so many people across the world in every generation. So for all of these reasons, for understanding, for remembering, for instruction, for perspective and praise, Let's study the history of the church together, and hopefully these videos will at least be a start in helping you to do so.